My name is Sean Morton, and this is Sonya Richmond. Until recently, Sonya worked as a GIS analyst and researcher, mapping bird population for Bird Studies Canada, and I worked as a photographer. 4 years ago, we sold our house, quit our jobs, and donated most of our possessions, pay for and begin a 28,000 kilometer hike on the Trans-Canada Trail. Today, we'll be explaining in a little more detail what we're doing, sharing some of our reasons for this undertaking, and elaborating on our goal of diversifying participation in the outdoors, as well as connecting the people to nature through birding, as well as seeing a lot of pictures of birds from coast to coast. We'll then share some photos and stories from the trail, explain how we're encouraging people to connect to nature during the past 4 years on the trail, and the importance of getting a diverse youth involved as community leaders.
So as Sean said, we are in the middle of hiking across Canada, which is not something that most normal people would regularly do. Now, it might sound very impressive, walking carefree each day, trekking from sea to sea, and sleeping under the stars. But let's be honest, when you see pictures of us, you probably don't think of us as outdoors people, explorers, or adventurers. But that's the thing we're trying to show people. To be an explorer, you don't need to be a professional athlete. You don't need specialized skills or expensive equipment, and you don't need to be super rich. All you really need is simple curiosity. And from our own backyards to the boreal, Canada's nature is just waiting to be explored. And the Trans-Canada Trail is pretty much the perfect place to begin doing that.
Now, seeing as we're talking to a group from Vancouver, I'm sure many of you are well familiar with the Trans-Canada Trail, as you have a great deal of it in the greater Vancouver area. However, for those who aren't familiar with the TCT, it's also known as the Great Trail, Sentier Transcanadien, Le Grand Sentier. It's got a number of names, but don't worry, you're not alone in not knowing about it. First off, it's the longest recreation pathway in the world. It's presently 28,000 kilometers long and goes to 15,000 Canadian communities. It stretches from Cape Spear, Newfoundland on the Atlantic Ocean to Victoria, BC on the Pacific coast to Tuktoyaktuk, Northwest Territories on the shorelines of the Arctic Ocean. Though most people don't realize it, the TCT is within 30 minutes of 80% of Canadians. This means, especially for all of you, if you've ever gone for a walk on a local trail in your community, it's more than likely you've already trekked part of the Trans-Canada Trail system. When we've completed our journey, we'll have walked from Cape Spear to Victoria to Tuktoyaktuk, visiting all three of Canada's oceans. Now, as you can imagine, most people aren't crazy enough to undertake the entire length of this trail. In fact, fewer people have completed the entire trail on foot than have gone to the moon. According to Canadian Geographic, it's so large, if you started walking right now, it would take you between 3 and 4 years to finish. That's if you were to keep hiking at a brisk pace every day, through every type of weather condition, during every season. And to put it in perspective, when stretched out end to end, the Trans-Canada Trail reaches almost 2/3 of the way around the globe.
So when people hear these huge distances, their main question very often is, why on earth did you choose to undertake such an epic journey? Well, our main reason was that we felt like the digital world was taking over our lives and those of our family members. We were spending our days working in front of computers, our nights watching Netflix, and in between we were constantly checking Facebook, Instagram, or email. At the same time, a younger family member was skipping more than 40 days of high school each semester. He was stealing and lying, and eventually he lost most of his friends, all just to play video games. And in a way, it's no wonder. Studies have shown that the effects of video gaming and social media on the brain are stronger and more addictive than those of drugs like heroin. So even though we were almost constantly connected to Wi-Fi, we were becoming increasingly disconnected from each other, the natural world, and everything that was actually important in our own lives. We realized it was time to begin recharging ourselves and not just our devices, and we wanted to do something that was a little bit different. So what did we do? We wanted to get outside and get active, but we weren't particularly athletic people, and we didn't have a lot of extra money. So we focused on the one thing that's free. We figured we could walk. Between 2014 and 2018, step by step, we hiked across Ontario on the Bruce Trail. Then we set out across Spain on the Camino Frances. We trekked across France on the Via Pondensis. And soon after that, we hiked the length of Portugal on the Camino Portuguese. These were inspiring and life-changing adventures. And pretty much the moment each one ended, we eagerly began planning our next one.
Now, while spending our vacation time hiking was fantastic, like a lot of Canadians, we were still spending most of our year in front of screens, dreaming of our next big adventure. But as you can all attest after the last few years, digital landscapes are no replacement for natural ones. So that was when we started to realize that getting outside, connecting with nature, and having adventures aren't things that had to happen only once a year. They didn't have to occur in far off countries, require extensive planning, and they certainly didn't need to cost a fortune. So instead of trying to cram our entire bucket list of adventures into a few precious vacation days each year, we want to find a way to connect with nature on a more regular basis.
Now, nature means different things to different people. I think it's fair to say that when most people think of nature, they tend to imagine tracts of pristine, untouched wilderness. Or we might think of national or provincial parks or conservation areas. What many of us tend to overlook is that nature can be found everywhere, even in Canada's largest cities. It can be found in green spaces and river corridors, in the trees outside our windows, in the plants that come up between the cracks in the pavement, in the birds at our feeders, and of course, in our own backyards. There are opportunities to explore and discover everywhere. All we have to do is step outside our doors. Now, that seemingly simple realization is important because if we let ourselves think of nature, adventure, and exploration as things that exist only in pristine wilderness or in some far-off exotic location, the result is that we spend the majority of our time in front of screens planning or fantasizing about our next big trip, which we may or may not ever get a chance to actually take. Now, that simple idea is ultimately what led us to walk across the second biggest country in the world in the name of conservation, and with the goal of inspiring people of all ages, cultural backgrounds, abilities, genders, orientations, and identities to get outside and connect to nature on a more regular basis through birding.
So I imagine that you're all curious to know what our hike has been like so far. Well, we started on June 1st, 2019, and in 556 days, we've trekked just more than 14,000 kilometers from Cape Spear, Newfoundland, across 10 provinces to Victoria, British Columbia. En route, we've seen and experienced some pretty amazing things. We've been the first to see the sunrise in North America. We've scaled cliffs on rope ladders, walked on coastal footpaths, seen icebergs and puffins, spent evenings on the sides of crystal clear lakes, and gone days in remote wilderness without meeting anyone else. We've seen whales and seals in both the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, watched herds of caribou on the trail, encountered moose and deer on the pathway, listened to coyotes call throughout the evenings around our tent, had black bear encounters in almost every province, and of course seen hundreds of species of birds. Yet best of all, along the way, we've experienced overwhelming generosity, random acts of kindness, and countless words of encouragement from people and communities everywhere. Now, each day, depending on the weather, terrain, and water availability, we hike an average of between 25 and 35 kilometers on the Trans-Canada Trail. This has varied from 5 kilometers on our first day on the East Coast Trail in Newfoundland, when we ended up scaling a cliff face on a rope in the middle of an unexpected snowstorm, to as much as 55 and 60 kilometers a day along the highways of Ontario and the vast landscapes of the prairies, when there's simply no place for us to stop for the night. Usually while hiking, we carry everything we need in our backpacks, which means we have our tent, sleeping bags, air mattresses, camp stove, water filter, food, and of course, our binoculars, bird guides, and our photography gear. As you can probably imagine, our packs are pretty heavy and often weigh between 40 and 60 pounds each, depending on the amount of food we need to carry between resupply points. Each of our days usually involves us getting up around 6 in the morning, having breakfast, packing up by about 7, and hiking until 5:30 at night or nightfall. In the evening, we set up camp, wash if possible, make dinner, and filter water. Then around 7 or 8 o'clock, about the time we simply want to stop moving and lay down, this is when our workday actually begins. This means throughout the night, we plan the next day's hike, as well as write our journals, draft and post a daily blog, edit photographs, update social media, answer emails, prepare for presentations, or at times give presentations, which we've done from the tent countless times. And this takes us till about 1 a.m. And this was what the first 14,000 kilometers on the Trans-Canada Trail generally looked like.
Now, of course, it has not been all hard work and no fun. It has been well worth it. So as you know, our cross-country adventure began in Newfoundland, where we were screeched in, kissed a cod, attended a lobster boil-up on the beach, and met some of the friendliest people in Canada. Now, the Trans-Canada Trail in Newfoundland offers 2 very different experiences along 2 very different routes. The East Coast Trail is a series of 25 footpaths for hikers that traces the rugged coast of the Avalon Peninsula, whereas the Trailway Trail follows the bed of the former provincial railway through the wild, remote, and sparsely populated center of the province. So we began on the East Coast Trail, which in places was extremely steep and rugged, involving rope-assisted climbs and descents, while in other stretches it followed boardwalks, pebble beaches, and forested pathways. Along the way, we saw humpbacked and minke whales, seals, bald eagles, and crystal blue icebergs off the coast. We marveled at towering cliffs and headlands, saw sea stacks emerging out of the mist like something from Lord of the Rings, and watched as water was shot 40 meters into the air by a natural wave-driven geyser. We walked across a 50-meter suspension bridge and admired the Berry Head Arch. In addition, we visited the famous Cape Spear Lighthouse, which is at the very easternmost point in North America, and the colony of Avalon, which was one of the founding European settlements in Canada. Perhaps most impressive of all was seeing North America's largest colony of Atlantic puffins in the Witless Bay Ecological Reserve near Bay Bulls. Now, in addition to puffins and eagles, along the ECT, we had a chance to see many other seabird species as well, such as northern gannets, razorbills, black guillemots, and common mirrors. Amid all of this, we were treated like family by strangers, invited to boil-ups, and enjoyed impromptu kitchen parties along the way.
So after the coastline, we follow the Railway Trail, which crosses the province from east to west, and it's a gravel track that's primarily used by a thriving community of friendly ATVers and snowmobilers. The trail took us through the remote and spectacular scenery of the boreal forest, far from towns and cities, which was something we had both longed to see. The boreal ecosystem covers 60% of Canada's area, and it stretches right across the northern part of the nation from Newfoundland to British Columbia. It's an incredibly important ecosystem because many of North America's largest rivers begin in the boreal, and it provides us all with clean air and clean water. It's also known, as I'm sure many of you know, as North America's bird nursery, because more than 300 species of birds live in the boreal, and between 3 and 5 billion birds are born there every year. In fact, many of the birds people see in their own backyards throughout North America rely on the boreal region. On the trailway, many of our days began with the sounds of loons on pristine lakes and the sight of the sun rising over bogs filled with wildflowers. We were also privileged to watch a herd of caribou cross a plateau in front of us one day, be regularly visited by moose, and discover these 2 black bears outside of our tent one morning, as well as share the trail with a rare pine marten one afternoon. In terms of birds, we enjoyed species such as boreal chickadee, Canada jay, ruby-crowned kinglets, pine grosbeak, flycatchers, and of course the countless migratory warblers, which I have an intense problem in figuring out because to me they all look the same. As we crossed Newfoundland, most of our adventure was in wilderness, but when we reached Cape Breton, Nova Scotia, that changed somewhat.
So when we left Newfoundland and hiked into Nova Scotia, we left the boreal behind, and the trail took us south through Cape Breton Island into the famous Cape Breton Highlands National Park, to the home of Alexander Graham Bell, and along the Celtic shoreline. Along the way, we found active fishing harbors, beautiful beaches, wonderful views out over the Atlantic Ocean, museums, and of course, plenty of wildlife. En route, the trail provided panoramic views down the coast and took us through some scenic forests. Now, one of the highlights for us was a long stretch of pathway known as the Celtic Shores Trail, which runs along the coast of Cape Breton Island, winding through fishing communities, down pristine beaches, and through towns that are filled with wonderful art and Celtic music. We also marveled at the huge number of bald eagles in the Brass Door Lake region and watched great blue herons, semi-palmated plovers, least sandpipers, ruddy turnstones, and willets along the shoreline. In addition to all of this, we enjoyed the Celtic music of the Rankin family and savored fresh lobster while watching the sunset over the Atlantic Ocean.
Now, beyond the culture of Cape Breton, the natural wonders in Nova Scotia were a highlight for us as well. Among our favorites was visiting the Bay of Fundy and getting to see a tidal bore. The Bay of Fundy is home to 16-meter high tides, which are the highest in the world. When the tide comes in, it starts to fill all the rivers that naturally flow out into the bay. A tidal bore looks like a wall of water traveling up these rivers, and it occurs at the moment when the rivers change direction and begin flowing in the opposite way. In addition to the tides, the vast mudflats that are exposed at low tide are some of the most important stopover points for migrating shorebirds in North America. We visited during the fall, so we had a chance to see lots of different species of birds, including greater yellowlegs, black-bellied plovers, and spotted sandpipers. This is, of course, only a sampling of the amazing experiences and nature in Nova Scotia. The pathways also took us through forests and green spaces, to ancient harbor towns, let us learn about Mi'kmaq history, and gave us a chance to explore historical forts.
Now, next on our journey, we ventured across to Prince Edward Island, and we would have to say that out of the 3,000 kilometers of Trans-Canada Trail in the Maritime provinces, in our opinion, the crown jewel is PEI's 435 kilometers of path, which is known as the Confederation Trail. While PEI might be the nation's smallest province, it boasts one of the nicest trail systems that we've encountered yet, although the route through Quebec does provide some pretty stiff competition, as you'll see in a bit. So the Confederation Trail runs from one tip of the island to the other, forming a complete network of pathways across the province. The entire trail is kept in immaculate condition, and it's composed of extraordinarily well cared for pathways under corridors of shade trees. It features information plaques along the route, distance signage, and shelters for resting, picnicking, or camping along the way. Now, these things might be things you take for granted living in the Vancouver area where you have very nice trails, but up until this point, we could have only dreamed of this kind of infrastructure along the Trans-Canada Trail. So basically the nature of the Confederation Trail, with its beautiful rolling hill scenery, quaint villages, and broad bay seascapes, makes it the perfect means for island-wide exploration. You really couldn't ask for more. So in Prince Edward Island, we toured the province from the ferry to the Confederation Bridge, relishing the hospitality of Charlottetown, resting on the red sand of its endless beaches, and enjoying the natural beauty of the island while taking in as much of Green Gables as we could. En route across the province, we also saw a ridiculous number of great blue herons, as well as a variety of forest birds, such as common yellowthroats and northern flickers, shorebirds, and of course, waterfowl as well. So in terms of exploring and experiencing nature, PEI is a wonderful place to visit.
We next visited New Brunswick, which we arrived into after crossing the long Confederation Bridge from PEI. In New Brunswick, we explored Acadian heritage, relaxed in peaceful forests, ventured through marshlands while birdwatching, and enjoyed amazing urban trails. Here we returned to the Bay of Fundy and followed the trail through pristine coastal wilderness and hiking along the tough Fundy footpath. Afterward, we followed roads through rolling hills, forested regions, and spent days hiking along the beautiful St. John River heading north. In New Brunswick also offers some fantastic urban pathways through its larger cities like St. John, Moncton, and Fredericton. Similarly, in the university town of Sackville, the Trans-Canada Trail became a fully accessible boardwalk that took us through a 55-acre waterfowl park. Here, over 160 species of birds, including the double-crested cormorant, American widgeon, northern pintails, hooded mergansers, and white-throated sparrows, as well as 200 species of plants have been sighted in the marsh. And even though it was pouring rain when we walked through here, the trail was full of people out enjoying this beautiful natural space within the city limits. The Riverside Trail in Fredericton was another amazing example of a wonderful urban pathway in New Brunswick. The paved walkway took us along the banks of the St. John River, past beautiful historic estates, and to some of the city's main attractions, all the while keeping us underneath a majestic canopy of old hardwood trees that we wouldn't truly appreciate until we were deep into the prairies. The urban trails of New Brunswick therefore serve as clear proof that nature can be enjoyed and explored in our own backyards and green spaces across Canada.
So when we completed hiking across New Brunswick in November of 2019, it meant that we had finished trekking across all of Canada's Maritimes region. With a few weeks of good weather left, we hiked into Quebec on the Petite Temie to the shores of the St. Lawrence Seaway and the community of Rivière-du-Loup. And we arrived there amid a huge snowstorm with freezing cold temperatures. And since we have no winter gear with us at all, we pretty quickly decided to end our first year on the Trans-Canada Trail at that point. Now, as we all know, COVID emerged in 2020 and provinces began limiting travel. Because of this, when we tried to return to the trail in Quebec in May, we found that the border was closed to travel. So as a result, Quebec stands as the only province that we have walked piece by piece and in every season over the course of the past 4 years, rather than consecutively from east to west. Now, despite the logistical challenges involved in completing the Belle Provence, our time there was absolutely amazing. The pathways of Quebec are perhaps the most highly developed and refined in the nation, and they took us from the rugged footpaths in the Charlevoix region over the incomparable Sentier des Caps, and eventually connected to the extensive multi-use cycling pathways and rail trails of the Route Verte. Along the way, the Trans-Canada Trail in Quebec took us along pilgrimage routes to historic sites and through stunning landscapes as we moved across the province. Now, one of the exciting things about trekking across Quebec was having the opportunity to visit so many IBAs, or important bird areas. Now, I imagine that most people who are listening tonight are very familiar with the concept of an important bird area. But for anyone who isn't, basically they are exactly what their name suggests. They're an area that's important to birds. So this can be because it supports a high diversity of different species, or because it provides habitat for a rare or endangered species, or because it's used as a stopover site for migrating birds that need to rest and refuel. There are around 10,000 IBAs in the world, 600 of which are here in Canada. Now, Quebec is home to 102 IBAs, many of which are located along the shores and on the islands of the St. Lawrence Seaway. And luckily for us, the Trans-Canada Trail took us within about 20 kilometers of 26 of these IBAs in Quebec. So as we walked along the St. Lawrence Seaway, it was fall, so many of these IBAs were absolutely filled with thousands of snow geese, as well as large flocks of gulls, ducks, and double-crested cormorants. And while we were camping up on the Sentier des Caps, we could actually hear the sounds of the ducks and geese down on the water below us every night. And it sounded like this giant cocktail party going on, which was really quite amazing to hear. As a side note, there are about 86 IBAs located in British Columbia, over 30 of which are in the Greater Vancouver area and on Vancouver Island. So I'm sure most of you have visited an IBA in your travels or in your work, but if not, I would highly recommend checking them out.
Now, upon reaching Ottawa, the nation's capital, it also meant that we were again in a new province, Ontario, which is one of the most challenging to summarize. With 6,000 kilometers of trail in the province, it took us almost 4 months of trekking to cover our sections. This is equivalent to walking from Toronto, Ontario to Disney World, Florida. In Ontario, the Trans-Canada Trail stretches from Ottawa in the east to Windsor in the south to Thunder Bay in the north. Ontario's trails run through the nation's capital, huge city centers that take weeks to cross on foot, across vast rural landscapes, quiet Indigenous communities, and to beautiful provincial parks, as well as rugged national parks. Along the way, we visited amazing historic sites, explored regions of environmental significance, and ventured across the northern shorelines of Lake Superior. Now, despite the challenges and distances involved in crossing Ontario and its sprawling cities, we actually had a wonderful time, and we got to see tons of nature and species, far more than even we anticipated. Here we encountered a huge assortment of wildlife on the trail, including porcupine, beavers, deer, moose, and of course, once again, black bear. In addition to which, we saw over 100 species of birds in Ontario alone, including eastern bluebirds, Baltimore orioles, scarlet tanagers, indigo buntings, and northern hawk owls, just to name a few, reaffirming our belief that wildlife and birds can be found anywhere in Canada, whether in a provincial park, in an urban green space, or in our own backyards here at home.
So near the conclusion of our second year on the TCT, and with the fall colors around us, we crossed the border into Manitoba. Here we began by hiking through the beautiful Whiteshell Provincial Park, heading more north than west as we went. Now, this huge park looked a lot like Northern Ontario, with its vast coniferous forests, marshes, and exposed Canadian Shield. However, after eastern Manitoba, the trail followed the Winnipeg and Red Rivers through Indigenous reserves and Mennonite communities, passing many enormous hydroelectric dams along the waterways. As the trail wove its way slowly westward and we approached Winnipeg, the landscape changed from the sprawling boreal forest and Canadian Shield to the vast, wide open prairies and agricultural lands with their endless skies. From the provincial capital, the TCT then ventured southward along the Crow Wing Trail, which is a pilgrimage route that took us to the Canadian-US border, where the trail again shifted course, taking us northward along gravel roadways and unmaintained rail trails, which eventually led us to our next province. So as we hiked across Manitoba and into the prairies, we had a chance to see quite a bit of wildlife, including beavers, river otters, red squirrels, wood frogs, and of course, white-tailed deer. And almost every single night that we camped, we heard packs of coyotes singing and calling as they hunted around our tent. Sometimes they were quite close to us as well. So even in this vast and seemingly empty agricultural landscape, there was still plenty of wildlife. It just took us a while to get used to learning how to spot it. Now, as you might expect, one of the exciting things about hiking out of the boreal forest and into the prairies was that we started to encounter a new group of bird species that don't typically occur in eastern Canada. So some of the more exciting birds that we managed to see included Harris's sparrows, Lapland longspurs, black-billed magpies, and best of all, in my opinion, large groups of American white pelicans. So seeing these enormous, strange-looking birds was truly an amazing experience.
Entering into Saskatchewan, the Trans-Canada Trail continued to weave us on a route that was more south and north than westerly. Apart from the beautiful sections of the trail in the provincial parks and city centers like Regina, Moose Jaw, Saskatoon, and North Battleford, we mostly found ourselves following dusty, long gravel roads for about 1,600 kilometers. Heading westwards, these grid roads took us past historic grain elevators through the stunningly beautiful Capel Valley, across old battlefields, then eventually through oil fields and landscapes dominated by huge rolling hills in the western portion of the province. And somewhat unexpectedly, in Saskatchewan, we would spend more time on ferries and rivers than in any other province. As we walked across the vast landscape, we realized it was one of extremes. We were walking through a brutal heat wave and drought, as well as at times trekking through thick smoke from forest fires 2 provinces away. Even the pathway would alternate between being dry and cracked soil and thick prairie mud on the rare occasions we experienced any type of rain. Yet at other times of the year, we were told, this region could also experience a deep cold, huge floods, and relentless winds. Much of the wildlife we saw had clearly adapted to these tough conditions, either by becoming small and living underground, like the Franklins and Richardson squirrels and white-tailed jackrabbits, or had become huge and strong, like the bison, black bear, and wapiti we frequently spot in the open landscape. In addition to which, we continue to see new species of birds, including American avocets, Virginia rail, and large groups of Franklin skulls. However, given that we were there in the fall of our 3rd year, one of the most impressive things by far was seeing and hearing huge flocks of hundreds of thousands of snow geese, ducks, and cranes flying overhead. Some mornings as we watched the sun rise, we would see continuous streams of birds stretching from one horizon to the other as they made their way south for the winter. Not only was this a spectacular sight, but it reminded us how birds connect us. After all, we'd seen similarly long lines of snow geese flying over the Laurentian Mountains and St. Lawrence River when we crossed Quebec. We saw them again in the prairies here in Saskatchewan, and we've seen them for years flying many times over British Columbia during migration season while visiting family on the Sunshine Coast.
Now, entering into Alberta, which was our 9th province, we were able to return to trekking along amazing rail trails, such as the quad-friendly Iron Horse Trail, historic routes such as the Victoria Trail, and urban pathways like those of Fort Saskatchewan, Edmonton, and Calgary, before turning west toward Banff and the Rocky Mountains. Alberta was particularly exciting to explore because it seemed to offer a little bit of everything, including a huge range of accessible historic sites, epic landscapes, and wildly different ecozones, including the prairie grasslands, the boreal, the aspen parklands, the foothills, and the Rocky Mountains. Now, the diversity of these ecoregions and the transition zones that occurred between them support a huge range of birds and wildlife which are specifically suited for the different landscapes. In addition, compared to the parts of the prairies that we trekked across the further east, much of the prairies in Alberta was ranch land instead of the more intensively managed row or cereal crops. And that also helped support a greater diversity of wildlife. So we enjoyed seeing everything from herds of huge, majestic elk to mule deer, which were often right in the middle of towns hanging out on people's front lawns, to red and golden mantled ground squirrels in the mountains, to colorful insects like this hummingbird clearwing. Now, of course, the diverse landscapes of Alberta also supported a wide variety of different bird species as well, from grassland species to waterfowl to warblers of the boreal forest, to a suite of new species that we hadn't seen east of the Rocky Mountains. Varied thrushes, mountain chickadees, American three-toed woodpeckers, and Clark's nutcrackers were just some of the new species that we were really excited to see as we moved westward.
And finally, we come to our last province, British Columbia, which we entered into by trekking over the Elk Pass and through the Elk Valley. Moving westward, we crossed the Selkirk Mountains, walked the Rocky Mountain Trench, hiked the Kettle Valley Rail Trail, all before venturing across the Greater Vancouver area and Vancouver Island. In the process, the National Trail led us to explore hot springs, hoodoos, and glacial lakes. It took us through long train tunnels, along vast rail trails, and led us to welcoming historic frontier towns. In BC, we also had to increasingly deal with the impact of natural disasters, including landslides, floods, and forest fires that not only destroyed entire communities, but also huge sections of the Trans-Canada Trail itself. Beyond these challenges, however, we are constantly amazed by the province's cultural splendor, beautiful landscapes, and its huge variety of wildlife and birds. En route, we were fortunate to see an amazing diversity of wildlife, including bighorn sheep, mountain goats, and black bear, as well as everything from butterflies to bats. Several species of snakes, including the western terrestrial garter snake, northern American racer, northern rubber boa, and gopher snake, in addition to a stunning number of different orb weavers and several black widow spiders. Beyond all these, we've also seen a huge number of birds as well on BC's birding trails, along the Pacific Flyway in Vancouver, and a number of the important bird areas that we were fortunate to explore. Finally, in November of 2022, we walked with members of the Victoria Natural History Society and BC Nature to Clover Point in Victoria to officially complete the Atlantic to Pacific portion of our journey on the Great Trail. When we conclude the main part of our hike across Canada, we often got asked what insights we'd gained along the way. This, of course, is a difficult question to answer, but one of the things that has become evident is that if you want something to work, whether it's a farm, a business, the development of a local trail, or the conservation of a local green space, it's essential that local residents are engaged with and help with these initiatives. From what we've seen, the greatest challenge to any endeavor arises when local people are not consulted. They're not part of the decision process and aren't involved with leading projects in their own communities. This is why it's absolutely necessary to get youth involved in their communities, and with groups like the Lions, the Shriners, Legion, and of course, nature organizations, all of whom are facing declining numbers. This is a challenge as a disengaged youth will invariably impact on the success of local initiatives in the future, while an engaged youth will propel regional development and conservation for decades to come.
Now, there is no way to summarize 556 days of hiking across our beautiful country, but hopefully our whirlwind tour has given you an idea of some of the different experiences Canada's Trans-Canada Trail has to offer. We've shown you photos of incredible wilderness and wildlife, and we've shared some of our favorite urban pathways. The reality is, however, that by connecting 15,000 communities across Canada and by visiting all the provincial capitals, quite a bit of the trail is actually in or very close to urban areas. So in other words, much of the Trans-Canada Trail is outside the door of most Canadians. And because of this, it is free, easily accessible, and open to everyone to explore in their own way.
So as I'm sure you all know, as Canadians, we have these incredible opportunities to connect with nature, literally in our own backyards, in our communities, and our parks. We're told all the time that being outside increases our self-esteem and self-awareness, that it reduces the effects of stress and anxiety, it improves our concentration and fosters creativity and innovation. And over the past few years, a growing number of people, of course, have come to experience the benefits of nature firsthand. So now, as nature enthusiasts, we have a wonderful opportunity to transform people's interest in nature into action. Unfortunately, despite the evident benefits of nature, people are often hesitant to head outdoors. And we have to ask the question, why is this? Well, many people have the sense that time in nature is non-productive and therefore a waste. There's a pervading social fear that being outside is dangerous and it should be avoided. We were often told that nature's sole goal is to hunt and kill people. There are a lot of people, in fact, that seemingly believe this. It also has to do with the sense that connecting with nature is only possible or worthwhile if we're fully immersed in pristine wilderness, or that real outdoor adventure requires us to travel to some far off and exotic location. In Ontario, for instance, many people believe that nature is only found in Algonquin Park. And the number of people we found as we walked across BC that believed you had to go to Banff or Jasper to find nature was kind of staggering. And finally, and unfortunately, there's also the perception that outdoor activities are something only to be enjoyed by a select few in certain locations and at certain times. We've been taught to think that nature is supposed to look a certain way, and that to be outdoors, we have to look a certain way or be a certain type of person. But none of this is true, of course. Nature is not in one special place, and it's not for one special person. Nature is wherever someone is trying to find it, and it is absolutely for everyone. The pursuit of nature and time outdoors is enough to make you a birder, an explorer, and an outdoors person. And this is the point that we've been trying to emphasize in communities as we've hiked for the past 4 years.
Now, we are trying to use our hike to break down some of the barriers to getting outside every day that Sean just mentioned. But of course, under normal conditions, those aren't even the biggest issues that come into play for most of us on a daily basis, including our children and grandchildren. The biggest issue is, of course, screen time. Most kids now spend more time on their devices than in nature. Many would rather play video games than play outside after school, and most adults would rather watch a movie or scroll through Facebook and Instagram rather than going outside for a walk after a long day at the office. And this is largely because such activities take us offline and away from our screens. So the key isn't to try to convince people to give up what they enjoy doing, but rather to find ways to help people use technology and our mobile devices to explore the world. So we are trying to help people do just that by reconnecting to nature through birding. And when people hear this, they often ask us, well, why birds? Now, I'm sure that many of you could probably answer this question, but basically it comes down to the fact that birds are a great way to connect with nature because they are free and fun to watch, and they are literally everywhere. No matter who you are or where you live, whether it's in an RV, an apartment building or condo tower, in the suburbs or somewhere way out in the country, it is impossible to go outside your door and not hear or see at least one bird. Now, more than all of this, birds are a great way to connect with nature because they need our help. So according to the State of Canada's Birds Report, some groups of birds are doing very well, like waterfowl and birds of prey. And actually, those two groups represent a really nice example of how widespread conservation efforts across North America have made a huge difference in helping birds rebound and thrive. Other groups like grassland birds and aerial insectivores, which are birds that feed on flying insects, are not doing so well, and they need our help. So where do we begin? Well, one place to begin, as we try to show youth and others who are brand new to the outdoors, is by becoming a citizen scientist. Now, I imagine many of you, again, in the audience are already citizen scientists, but for anyone who is unfamiliar with this term or this concept, basically, it's someone who makes observations about birds or nature and then reports them online to help scientists understand how our wildlife populations are doing. So citizen science is great because it means anyone can do it, whether you're 5 years old or 95, whether you're an amateur or an expert birder. As long as you love going outside, finding really cool things, and learning to identify what they are, you can be a citizen scientist. And the wonderful thing is, it can be a lot of fun to do with the help of a few free apps for your phone. Now, as I'm sure you know, there are several free apps you can use not only to learn about birds, but also to submit your observations to become a citizen scientist. For any birders in the group, I imagine you are already avid eBird users. This is great because eBird is probably the top platform in the world for submitting bird observations. However, in our experience, people who are brand new to birding often have trouble using eBird when they're not in a group or being supervised. So the app that we most often recommend to beginner birders is iNaturalist, which is also freely available for anyone with a mobile device to download and use. iNaturalist is nice because it is very simple to use. Basically, you just take a photo of something in the natural world and upload it to the app. You're then presented with a series of photos that you can compare your own with to help you identify what you just took a picture of. Once you submit your photo, you'll get confirmation or a correction for your ID, and your observation will become valuable data that scientists can use to monitor our wildlife populations. Now, the other great thing about iNaturalist, especially for beginners, is that you can submit observations of almost anything in the natural world. So not just birds, but also butterflies and other insects, bats, reptiles, mammals, trees and flowers. Whatever you are interested in, this app will work with it. In addition, the app also keeps track of your observations. So like eBird, you can build a life list of all of the species you've seen and where you saw them. If you use the Seek version of the app, which is great for kids, you'll be invited to enter different challenges. So as you build up your collection of species, you'll earn badges for different achievements. So for anyone with kids or grandkids who play video games, this might start to sound pretty familiar. You travel around collecting things, you complete various challenges, you compete with your friends, and you earn achievements. So citizen science is a lot like video gaming, which is something that many people already love to do, but with several very important differences. It gets you outside and being active. It teaches you about birds and other wildlife. It helps you connect with the natural world, and it makes a huge contribution to conservation. Birds and citizen science are a great way to bridge the divide between our digital world and the natural one, and they are the perfect tools to make exploration and outdoor adventure part of our everyday routines.
Now, of course, beyond citizen science involvement, we also share 6 simple steps that anyone can take in their own backyards and communities, which let them have a huge positive impact on bird conservation. These simple actions include buying bird-friendly products, such as shade-grown or bird-friendly coffee, or items with less packaging. Keeping cats indoors and dogs on a leash, especially while on beaches and places like plover habitat, for example. Making the yards bird-friendly. Helping to prevent bird window collisions by putting up decals on their windows. Turning off unnecessary lights, especially during migration season, so that we don't confuse birds who are migrating. And finally, by helping to get local youth involved who have an interest in nature to become engaged in conservation and become active leaders in their communities.
Now, the wonderful thing is, when we choose to help birds, our actions have a positive impact beyond our own backyards, our own communities, and even our own country. As you know, many bird species are migratory, which means that the birds we see in our own backyards and work hard to protect locally rely on other habitats as well as the ones that we observe them in. In Canada, the boreal forest is one key example of an essential habitat that is particularly important for many birds. As Sean mentioned, it's known as Canada's bird nursery because over 300 species breed there, and it accounts for the well-being of between 3 and 5 billion birds. So essentially, this means that any actions we take in our own backyards and communities have a profound impact on conservation efforts across the continent, and they help bird species from coast to coast to coast. In essence, it means that our backyards are connected to the boreal. And so if you're putting up a bird feeder or a bird bath in your own area, then you're having an impact that extends well beyond your own backyard. So with all of that said, we will end our talk here. We'll just close by saying that right now we have an unprecedented opportunity to reach out to new audiences across the country. And we hope that our hike and our message will help inspire people to reconnect with nature and to take advantage of this opportunity. If you'd like to follow our hike through our blog or online, the links are on the screen right now. And we hope that you will take the opportunity to follow along as we continue our hike for birds. Now, if you have any questions, hopefully we will be able to answer them now, or if we don't get to that successfully, we're happy to answer any questions you have online. But thank you all very much for taking the time to listen.
Well, thank you very much, Sonya and Sean, for that presentation. It's really interesting to hear about your travels, and it was all great. We had one question come in the chat, which is how many boots and socks did you wear out on the trip, and what are the best socks?
Well, I guess we've both gone through about 10 pairs of shoes or boots now. That's maybe not part of the question, but I wear Keen boots. Sean wears Merrill hiking shoes. And we've also gone through about 5 pairs of sandals each now, hiking sandals. I guess in terms of socks, that's a hard question. I wear Darn Tough, and I've been pretty happy with them so far. I think Smart Wool have also been in our kit of hiking things, and we've been pretty happy with those as well.
My partner Michelle here was wondering where the mosquitoes were the worst.
That's a good question. I think in my memory, maybe it wasn't mosquitoes. The worst bugs were in a small town in Newfoundland. I think it was Badger, Newfoundland, in the boreal, because we were there in June in the spring, and holy moly, there were more bugs there than I've ever seen. Although everybody we've talked to has promised that when we head north into the Arctic, it's going to be like a solid wall of bugs. So that's something to look forward to. But we've actually gotten lucky because I guess for 2 years, our departures were kind of delayed each spring by a new wave of COVID. So we weren't able to set out until sort of the end of June when like super bad bug season was already done. And then we walked through a drought. So there was like no water anywhere and the bugs were fine. Like I think we've been really, really lucky with that.
Great. I'm going to take a chance here and turn on the ability of people to unmute themselves again to see if anybody has any questions they want to ask. So you can try unmuting and asking a question. There's one thing online here. What a journey. What are your plans going forward?
In about a month, we're leading a birding tour on PEI. They have a new trail called the Camino de la Isla, which circumnavigates the entire province. So we're going to do that for 40 days to get warm back up, and then we will head north. How far we get though is a matter of debate. So after that, we have lots of hiking plans, but who knows?
What did you do for supplying yourself with water every day? Because you were saying some of the places you were kind of a long way from any communities or things. Was there always supplies, and did you just filter it, or?
That's a really good question. I think the answer depends on where we were. Some places like Newfoundland, there was plenty of water. We could basically camp anywhere along the trail and we had water. Places like the prairies, especially because it was a drought, there was almost no water at all. And we actually ended up having little push carts that we had with us as well. And we each had a 10-liter jug of water in the bottom of that. Like we actually got the carts to have extra water. In between that, we did filter a lot. We had a Sawyer Squeeze water filter that we used for most of the time. Yeah.
There's a question, Jennifer's asking, do you have a good map of the Trans-Canada Trail and where it goes in Vancouver? But I think in general, is there a good map of the trail?
No. The Trans-Canada Trail, there's an online map and there's an app that sometimes works. It's been off for entire years though at a time. A lot of it, we put the GPX tracks into our phone and into a Garmin device to follow that. It can be very, very challenging to follow at times. Places like Vancouver, for instance, there's signs every 20 or 50 feet. So it's relatively easy once you know the way to follow it. Other places like Newfoundland, there's 3 signs in the entire province. So it becomes a bit more of a guessing game, and it kind of came a steep learning curve for us. So
I've been really disappointed with the labeling of the trail in Vancouver and figuring out where it is, because sometimes you'll see these posts with the little red and blue things on them, and then they just sort of end somewhere and there's no signs that say anything about where they go next.
yes, yeah, it's really variable across the country. We grew up on the Bruce Trail in Ontario, and we spent a lot of time in Europe on the Camino de Santiago. And both of them, you can see the next marker. The Bruce Trail, as a rule, you have to be able to see from one marker to the next. And so that makes it very easy to navigate 800 kilometers. The Trans-Canada Trail, it's reliant on volunteers. And so, I mean, you get in the prairies, and we've met trail builders who are like, well, everyone knows where the trail goes, so I'm not going to put signs up. And you're left going, well, not everyone knows where the trail goes. And then you get into other regions where the signing is incredible. The Redo Trail, the East Coast Trail. So it's very variable, and it's dependent on volunteers. It's a challenge for them.
There's another question from Joan asking, when are you starting your walk to the Arctic, and how will you restock your supplies along the way?
Well, that's a really good question. And we're currently in the process, I guess, of figuring out when we'll leave. PEI is probably going to be in May, so we'll probably head out sometime in June, likely. There's a bunch of logistical factors we're still working on. And
when you say PEI is going to be in May, you're leading a group tour there?
Mhm.
Yes, and that'll be about 40 days. So yeah, we'll probably head up around June, start walking north in June sometime. And the resupplies is another very good question that we are still in the process of figuring out. There are very few resupply points on that trail, and most of it we're just walking along the highway. And we're told the price of food is extremely expensive up there. So I think our trip north is going to involve a lot more resupply boxes, like mailing them ahead and picking them up at the post office is likely, but we have not figured that out yet.
And Jean was wondering, how heavy is your pack usually? How many days of food do you carry?
That again depends on where you are. If you're in New Brunswick on the Fundy footpath, you have 7 days. If you're in Northern Ontario, you can have 7 days. If you're in the prairies, it can go to 10 or 15 days. But if you're in places like Montreal, Toronto, and Vancouver, there's almost no need to carry food because you're going from small town to small town. Anytime you're hungry, you stop at Tim Hortons. So it depends. Empty, mine is about 55 pounds without food, I mean, not empty. And Sonia's is slightly lighter than that. So yeah, it really depends.
I had a bird question. I noticed your first flicker there was a nice yellow shafted flicker with the crescent at the back of its head. When did you guys see the flickers changing from the yellow shafted to the red shafted?
I was waiting for that. I was like asking every day, but we actually crossed. They were definitely yellow in the prairies, like right up until about Banff, I think. But we were walking there in October and we didn't see a whole lot of them. So I don't know where the shift was. Like we started seeing them again, probably in the just before Hope. I think we saw some of them like in that area and they were red.
Mm-hmm.
But there was a huge long distance where we didn't see any. So I don't know where the line was. It was kind of disappointing because I wanted to see the shift, like, and if there was overlap, like if you could see that, but.
Well, we were at this island last week and there was an intergrade flicker there with the crescent at the back, but then generally the reddish orange feathers.
That's cool.
Yeah.
2 questions. One is, where are you going to start your northern hike from? And the other one was in terms of clothing, like how much did you carry? Like, did you carry kind of 2 pairs of socks, or did you wash things every night? Were there things you washed every night, or?
The clothing question, we wore one set and we basically carried another set of clothing. So if you have a run of bad weather, you get to enjoy life in a different way. We also carried, of course, rain gear and a down stuffable jacket, that sort of thing. But our clothing was a bare minimum. We tried to wash every day, or at least air it out and try to dry it out every day. That didn't often happen though. Heading north, the break in the trail occurs right above Fort Saskatchewan, Alberta. So I think we will go back to there and start from there and head north. It connects over to Dawson Creek and then follows the highway up. It's 4,000 kilometers of highway. It's not the most inspiring thing that way. So, yes.
Sarah is wondering if it's possible to join you on part of your PEI bird trip and how you find out more about that.
We are in the process of designing that. We just got asked 2 weeks ago to do it. Someone had heard last year we led across 3 Camino routes, a birding tour in Spain. And we've been asked to do it in PEI. You can look at our webpage, comewalkwithus.online, and we'll announce things there and figure it out. But you would be most certainly welcome to walk along or join along as we get going. But we don't really have many details yet. I think that's what this weekend's going to be.
There's not a lot. You can send us an email too through our website. You can find out how to contact us and we'll get in touch with you as we learn what we're doing.
Oh, that sounds great. Joan asks, when going through cities, where do you stay? I would expect tenting would be difficult in urban areas.
Very much so. That's actually a lot of people's questions. When we set out, we kind of had planned that cities would be our big refuge. We have to go in and recharge devices. We carry heavy battery packs. So cities were going to be our big refuge. And we didn't really want to get into trying to stealth camp in cities. It just seemed like it was too much of a headache. And so it often winds up being motels. And when we say motels, we're not talking about the Hilton. We're talking about the cheapest motel you can find in towns. So it's not always glorious. But yeah, it's often motels in cities.
Now, I don't know if I've overlooked any more questions in the chat here. So if I've missed you, please do unmute yourself and say something. All right. Well, if there are no more, there we are. Where is your home now? From Brenda.
We don't have one. We sold our home to pay for the first 3 years of this. And so we don't have one anymore. We house sit in London, Ontario. And as our parents get older, they're in Sechelles, British Columbia. We visit there a great deal to help out.
How are you funding your trip now? You paid for the first 3 years with your house, but
That's a very good question. That's it. That's one of the challenges right now, actually, for going to the north all the way in 1 year, is we have to navigate that. So
just a question in terms of the kind of accommodation when you're passing through cities and areas. Do you ever kind of do anything like kind of an advanced shout out to local nature groups to see whether there's people who have, you know, spare rooms or backyards that you could attend in that would kind of keep your costs down and connect you with the local people, or is it just too complicated?
No, we definitely reach out to people, and we've given a lot of these presentations we've gone across. So we have been hosted a fair bit. Often people tend to live in the cities though, so we'll get like 6 offers in one town and then there's like nobody, which is very understandable, but not so convenient. But yes, people have been absolutely fantastic to us. And we have been hosted by quite a few people as we've gone across as well.
As you were saying, a big city could take you like several days to get across, eh? Yeah,
well, the GTA, for example, in Toronto is 800 kilometers. So it's a month. It's Peterborough to Barrie and Orillia, and it weaves back and forth. It can take a long time. Yes.
Need a lot of backyards.
Joan asks, did you see any rare or unusual birds along the way?
I don't think so. Not on the trip. I mean, one of the things that's hard about what we're doing is that we're basically, I mean, we're on foot. So even if, you know, a rarity shows up 20 kilometers away, we're not really mobile enough to go see it. So, I mean, we saw stuff every day. Well, maybe not every day, but we saw tons of stuff that we'd never seen before. So it was new to us, or it was just really exciting because, you know, like black-billed magpies are the most common things in the world in the prairie. But to us, they were like these crazy looking, cool birds. So we had loads of fun just seeing new things and going to new habitats that, you know, we don't get to see all that often. But in terms of rare things, not really on this trip. Like we just weren't mobile enough to chase anything down.
Were you e-birding along the way?
We were not. I started out doing it and it just got like, it was too much. I mean, trying to figure out what to do. I tried to do a daily sort of list every morning, but even that, we had so many days where we had no Wi-Fi and then my lists were getting melted, and I just, I decided to write up the birds that we were excited about and we remembered in the blog. And we've put a lot of stuff on iNaturalist, but we didn't end up e-birding the whole thing. Sadly, it is one of my regrets, but it was logistically one thing too many.
when we began planning this, we had done 2 Camino routes in Europe. And we had assumed it would kind of be the same way. I mean, you spend 30 days walking across Spain and you ride each night, but you've got a bed, and you can go out and have dinner. And if you don't get caught up, that's fine. You'll catch up when you get home. When we set out on this, we thought it would be the same way. But at this point, we have 750,000 pictures. And we have 800 blogs, which account to something like 1 million pages of typing. Like it became much bigger than we ever thought it was going to be. So logistically, things began to get sacrificed at one point. So.
Not seeing anything else in the chat here.
No.
So if you didn't see any rare or unusual species, what were some of the special birds to you, things that you hadn't encountered before that you got a chance to see on this trip?
Oh, there were lots. I mean, one of the earliest ones were the Atlantic puffins out in Newfoundland. I mean, I'd seen pictures of them, but never in real life. And they're like the most comical looking birds, just face planting in the ocean and like popping up like corks in the waves. The American white pelicans were incredibly impressive. I mean, I kind of knew they were there, but not in the numbers. And just watching those birds and seeing them like turn their beaks inside out and going fishing in the lakes, like that was incredible. And I mean, every owl we saw, we got really excited for, because I absolutely love owls and we never see them. Like we just suck at spotting them. So every owl we saw was like completely fantastic. I think one of the most recent ones was an owl we saw in the wilderness, and it actually like out a pellet while we were watching, which was, I thought, incredibly cool. It's really disgusting, but.
And how did you generally encounter the owls? So was it walking at dusk in the morning or the evening, or just when you were in camp? How did you tend to run across them?
Yeah, the one we got at night, he was calling outside of our tent, so it was just sheer luck. But often you'd just see something swoop in front of you on the trail, and you'd be fortunate to be able to locate it again.
Yep. Yeah.
Cool. Any other special birds?
I didn't hear the question, I don't think.
Well, we were talking about special birds, and then we stopped briefly at owls. I was just wondering if there was anything else on the list.
Do you remember any that were all of them?
Yeah.
I mean,
Did you guys get down to Grasslands National Park, that area in Saskatchewan?
No.
No.
So the Trans-Canada Trail doesn't go down there?
The Trans-Canada Trail until recently has a wonky relationship with provincial parks and national parks. It in fact tends to go around them, on the border of them, and doesn't go through them. Now that the Parks Canada has taken more of a role in running the Trans-Canada Trail, it would hopefully change. I think it would make for a much better trail. It's really horrifying to come to the gates of Morton National Park and Cape Breton Highlands and just have the trail go away from it. It's kind of heartbreaking. So even what we think will be our final walk from Windsor, Ontario to Toronto, in southwestern Ontario on the Trans-Canada Trail, it goes around Point Pelee and Long Point, deliberately strives to avoid them. And as a birder, that just kind of kills you to hear that. So we'll be detouring at those points.
Great. All right. How did you find out about pilgrimage trails in Canada, which you mentioned?
We walked a lot of them. They're wound up into part of the Trans-Canada Trail. So we discovered them as we went across. We hadn't really heard about them until we started doing the Trans-Canada Trail, and we were stunned. And it just became more and more and more of an interest of people who wanted to go do things like the Camino de Santiago during COVID and just couldn't. So when we started writing about it, a lot more people became interested in Canadian Caminos.
Mm-hmm. Oh, interesting.
Mhm.
All right, well, you guys are 3 hours ahead of us. It's getting on midnight there. And some people have been dropping off and questions are slowing down here. So maybe we'll wrap it up there, but I would like to thank you very, very much for that presentation. It was really interesting to hear. I certainly enjoyed learning about your adventures and wish you luck with the rest of your travels. You guys have like a Patreon page or GoFundMe or something like that, or just your social media presence?
I guess to answer your other question, we do not have Patreon yet. That is another thing that is in the works, but we do have a donation page on our website if anybody is interested.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you so much, and have a great evening, and good luck on your adventure in Prince Edward Island, and then your continuation up to the Arctic.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
All right. Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Good night.